It's time for Herd Mentality, the weekly episode where you control the discussion today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino, author of Go Bills and Buffalo's Run, also the co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Want to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome and shout out to our everydayers. You know who you are. Those of you who never miss a single episode, I appreciate y'all being here very, very much. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. Well, folks, it's that time of week. You supply the questions, comments, takes, whatever you have regarding the Bills, and I respond to them here on the podcast. And I really enjoyed this slate of questions because I think we're starting to get more and more of a feel for what this Bills team is going to look like on offense and defense. And the questions were really rooted in some of my thoughts on how that's all evolving to this point. So let's get into it. First one comes from Justin. Justin says, with 2 games in the books, what is your take on Sean McDermott's defense? I like it a lot, and it seems more aggressive. Could be risky at times, but it's a nice changeup. Love the simulated pressures. After 2 all-22s, what stands out to you? Also, Terrel Bernard looks good. So I have 3 things written down here that stand out to me about this defense, and maybe in some ways things that have surprised me. The first thing is that there has been so far way less blitzing than I expected. I thought this was going to be a blitz-heavy team, and so far it's not at all. The Bills are only blitzing on 11.8% of passing snaps, which is the 3rd lowest in the NFL. Now, the good news is they have a pressure rate of 30.1%, which is 5th best in the NFL. And we always talk about this dynamic of not needing to send the blitz to get pressure. And right now, the Bills are in that sweet spot. We talk about this with the Jets defense, and what makes it so good is they can rush 4 and get pressure and be able to drop 7 bodies into coverage. And so far, the Bills are able to do that as well. And so maybe that will change as the season moves along. Maybe it has something to do with playing Zach Wilson and Jimmy Garoppolo. But so far, less blitzing than I expected. I thought you would see a lot more safety and defensive back blitzes based on what I observed at camp and even some of preseason. But that hasn't been the case yet. The next thing is I've really enjoyed the disguise elements of this defense. Now, they're playing a ton of zone, but they're dressing up those zones differently. There's some very unique coverage rotations that have been really fun. There was a couple reps against the Raiders where they disguised it so that it was I think it was a quarters look, but the 2 high safeties wind up being Taron Johnson and Trey White, and then they had Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer buzz down and be, more intermediate defenders. It's some really unique stuff. So the coverage concepts and the disguises are really good. And also I would say the same thing about the fronts, where you're kind of muddying up things, putting a lot of guys up on the line of scrimmage, but then you're still only rushing 4 and you're dropping the rest. But I think they're putting offensive lines in good conflict with how they're able to disguise some of their pressure looks. And then the third thing is we're getting even more zone coverage than I expected. I thought there might be a little bit more man, and I think that's probably smart, playing to your personnel based on what you have. I don't think the Bills have a ton of speed in the secondary, so it's probably necessary to play a lot of zone, but the zone percentages are pushing like 90%. And you saw Leslie Frazier over the last couple of years lean into more man coverage, especially on some 3rd downs. And you haven't quite seen that out of Sean McDermott's defense to this point. So those are the things that really stand out to me conceptually. Now, player-wise, obviously, I've talked a ton about Terrel Bernard and how he's performed and, certainly exceeding my expectations. But I wanted to focus my answer here more on the concepts and what the scheme looks like. Next one here comes from Andrew, and I got this question from a bunch of people, so you're obviously quite interested in what this looks like. Andrew says, as I was watching this game on Sunday and even last Monday, it looks like we may have finally solved the yards after catch problem that we've had for the last few years. Did it just seem like we're getting a lot more yak so far this season, or do the numbers bear that out? So let's get into it. I've talked, I feel like, for the last 3-4 years about how little yards after catch the Bills offense produces. And even last year, Josh Allen was dead last in the NFL for yards after catch per completion at 4.4 yards. So let's talk about the year over year so far. Again, only 2 games. In 2022, Josh Allen enjoyed, I guess is the word I'm going to go with, 4.4 yards after catch per completion. Second worst among starters in the NFL. And only 38.5% of Josh Allen's total passing yards were yards after catch, also second worst in the NFL. This year, it is different. Now, the yards after catch per completion has not skyrocketed. It's up. It's at 4.8 yards after catch per completion, which is okay. I mean, almost a half a yard better. But here's where things are really different, and this is where you can really feel the improved yards after catch. 57.8% of Josh Allen's total passing yards are yards after catch, which is 8th most in the NFL. So it's not that they're getting that much more yards after catch per completion, but the overall percentage of the passing yards coming from yards after catch has increased 20%. And I think that speaks to Josh using some of the shorter passing game. His accuracy, like I talked about yesterday, is much better with the short passing game. And it's so far, it has improved. I mean, going from the second worst in percentage of passing yards that were yards after catch to top 10, 8th best right now. I like that. And that's not a knock on Josh Allen. It's just, to me, it's been low-hanging fruit on how the production can get easier. And so far, it's trending in the right direction. Next one here comes from Mike. Mike says, can you talk about the backfield usage throughout the game? I thought James Cook struggled early on. Then it almost seemed like he sat for a bit while Murray and Harris took the lead. Then when Cook eventually started getting the lion's share again, he was like a different back. I wonder if the different running styles help the individual backs perform more than we thought. After defending 2 downhill backs for so long, it looked like the Raiders defended Cook similarly with their lines, and he just beat them with speed. What are your thoughts on how the Bills rotated their backs? I like this question, Mike. And I would agree, the first series of the game, 2 runs to James Cook. And if you guys remember on the All-22 review, I talked about how James Cook was guilty of pressing the line of scrimmage too hard before getting downhill. And I thought that was really evident on those first 2 carries, especially the first one where, I mean, they had the defense split and James Cook is still pressing to his right. It's like, buddy, get downhill. And after that series, right, Terrel Bernard gets the interception. You have a short field, and they go to Latavius Murray. And obviously they score a touchdown, so you like that. But I thought it was good to get to Latavius Murray, not necessarily because James Cook didn't read the defense well and maximize those opportunities that he had in the first possession, but getting him going earlier, Murray going earlier, was something that I thought was a mistake against the Jets. They didn't get him going really at all, and I thought that would have been necessary to incorporate him a little bit more, not because of James Cook and any deficiencies that he has, but to give them a different style of back, right? It's a big difference defending James Cook as it is Latavius Murray or even Damien Harris. And so I think incorporating Murray and Harris earlier against the Raiders was really smart, and it allowed all 3 backs to kind of play to their strengths and challenge the defense with some different stylistic players. So I like that a lot. Good week-over-week adjustment. But something that's really stood out to me about the overall utilization of the running backs is that James Cook is getting a lot of volume. So far, he's on pace for 315 touches, and we talked a lot this offseason about how much volume James Cook is going to get. And I certainly leaned into the historical data of Bill's starting lead running backs and James Cook now being that, and it being Devin Singletary in the past, and that kind of being between 180 and 225 touches. And so I thought to myself, well, surely they're not going to go from James Cook, whose previous career high in touches, college and pro, was like 140, and all of a sudden get that to over 300. But so far through 2 games, it is that type of pace. And so I'm interested to see how that evolves. I'm interested to see how comfortable they are with that much volume going to James Cook, but so far so good. It seems he can handle it. And, we'll see what it looks like throughout the course of the season. So it's definitely been interesting to see this rushing offense and the utilization of the backs. It's nice to see that they have options, right? It's been in the past. I mean, the Bills didn't even dress 3 running backs on game day, right? I mean, Tywan Jones would dress for special teams, but it would be Devin Singletary and Zach Moss, Devin Singletary and James Cook. Now they're dressing 3 guys, and they're using all 3 guys, which is very interesting. One more note here. In terms of defenses and how they're playing the Bills, both the Jets and the Raiders stayed in nickel against the Bills' 12 personnel. And I say that now because that should be helpful for this Bills rushing offense. When you have small personnel on the field and you have big personnel facing them, right, 2 tight ends, you should get some good run looks. You should have some good blocking opportunities. And so I think that's been a nice little wrinkle here that's helped these running backs as well. All right, we got a bunch more to get to here, but first, our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Football host Vinny Iyer to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week all season long. So whether you're prepping for a draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide you with players that are guaranteed to fit on your roster. So let's see who Vinny has picked out for us on this week's eBay's Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week. Chiefs' second-year running back Isaiah Pacheco hasn't delivered much to his fantasy football managers yet this season, but be sure to roll him out of the garage for plenty of production on the ground, cleaning up against a bad Bears overall defense in Week 3. Pacheco should break some chunk runs with an excellent shot to score to provide punctuation in a home blowout. Vinny Iyer from Locked On Fantasy Football is going to help you win your fantasy championship, and eBay Motors knows a championship team is about each player being a perfect fit. Same with your vehicle. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof rack, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. So keep your ride or die alive at ebay.com/motors. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. All right, the next one here comes from Brian. Brian says, Eric Turner tweets out that the Bills have run 12 personnel on 50% of their snaps, most in the league. One of the things that was discussed when the Bills drafted Kincaid was how little 12 personnel they ran. What do you think of the monumental shift in their offense this year and the apparent impact that Kincaid has had on the offensive philosophy? Yeah, this is definitely happening, right? We talked about 12 personnel all off season long once they added Dalton Kincaid, and they're leaning into it, obviously. And that's a good thing. It shows their willingness to evolve. It shows a willingness to build a scheme around your talent and what suits them the best. I like those things. I've really enjoyed it to this point. I think having the 2 tight ends on the field helps with the spacing in terms of the passing game, where when you're playing 3 and 4 wide receivers all the time, some tendencies to kind of go vertical with that speed. And I think the tight ends are more players that work in the middle of the field, in the flats, areas of the field that we want Josh Allen to go to more. And I think that has happened, and I like that. I enjoy having bigger people in to block. One of my critiques of the Bills' rushing offense over the years has been, well, you're using Gabe Davis as the insert blocker. Well, now you're using a tight end, a bigger player, 20, 30 more pounds than Gabe Davis. And so incorporating more big people to run the football is helpful, especially when these defenses are staying in nickel. So I've enjoyed that. And I think it leads to more creativity. We saw that in how they've incorporated these tight ends in the protection schemes, and then, of course, then becoming receivers. I think there's been less predictability. You can put 12 personnel on the field, and it's not a tip that it's a run or a pass. They're willing to do both. So I really like it so far. So far, so good. I think it's allowed this team to play more to the style of football that I think is going to make them a bit more consistent. Jeff says, was wondering how Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer looked. Also, if you had to grade the offensive line, how would you rate them best to least as they all played? And this is referring to the Raiders game. So this is not necessarily a 2-week question. It's just the Raiders game. So we'll start with Poyer and Hyde. Folks, I'd be lying if I said I was thrilled with how they're playing. I think Hyde has been better than Poyer for sure. But they both seem a little rusty to me. Jordan Poyer with some of his triggering downhill and filling and playing the run. I think that's been kind of hit or miss. It was better against the Raiders and the Jets, but it's still not quite to the levels that I've seen in the past from him. And then Micah Hyde, I think in coverage, there's been some times where I feel like maybe he's playing a little bit too loose and a little bit too soft, where I think he can be tighter. I think he can be a little bit more anticipatory. I think some of those things haven't showed up in the same ways that they have in the past. So I think there's a little bit of rust here. I'm not going to lie. I think there's some rust here on Poyer and Hyde. And of course, naturally, you're thinking, wow, these are aging safeties and maybe they're cooked and this is going to be a problem. Let's see. Let's let it play out. It's not cost the Bills yet significantly, but I think that there's more for Poyer and Hyde to find themselves and be the tandem we want them to be. In terms of how the offensive line played against the Raiders, and the specific question being ranking them against the Raiders. And it's interesting because I think they played well collectively. I would say the top 3 are really close, but I'd grade them 1 Dawkins, 2 McGovern, 3 Morse. I think that was a clear, like your top 3, then maybe a little bit of a gap and you get to Osiris Torrence, and then a bit of a gap and you get to Spencer Brown. Like I said with Spencer Brown, the reason they stopped Max Crosby was the overall game plan and the scheme and how Spencer Brown functioned within that and the help that he had, and it just all worked. But Spencer Brown, on the few occasions where he was isolated up against Max Crosby, folks, it was rough. I mean, I said it yesterday, it took him to school. If they didn't have that game plan in place, I mean, it would have been a bloodbath for Spencer Brown, and Max Crosby would have feasted. So good job by the Bills to give Spencer the help that he needed, but I don't want to overstate his specific role in shutting down Max Crosby. The guy had a ton of help, as he should. And the run blocking was really good across the board. But factoring in the overall picture, I think Brown was clearly number 5. Next one here comes from Don. Don says, seems like the Trent Sherfield is only on the field to block for running plays. Could that start to be a tell that the Bills are running the ball? And he also says a couple of teams are doing the bulldozer quarterback sneak. I think that's called the tush push, right? Why wouldn't they put a running back or tight end under center? Seems like everybody knows that is the play, so maybe reduce the risk of quarterback injury. 2 questions here. So the first one is about Trent Sherfield and his utilization. So let's start here. The top 5 options in this offense are pretty clear. Diggs, Davis, Cook, Knox, and Kincaid. That's 5 players that are ahead of everyone else on this offense, and they should be. So when you start getting into the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th option in the passing game, there's not going to be a ton of volume there. So let's be mindful of that. Now, secondly, Trent Sherfield has played 43 snaps this year. 20 of them were passing plays. 23 were running plays. And so there's not a tip. There's not a Trent Sherfield's on the field. They're going to pass or they're going to run. They've done literally half of each. And then Deontay Hardy's played 30 snaps. Khalil Shakir, 19. The reality is the Bills know who their best players are on offense, and they're going to play. And so all these other guys, Sherfield, Hardy, Shakir, Quentin Morris, I mean, you're talking about the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th options in this offense. So there's been some comments about Trent Sherfield and his role to this point. There's not a lot of volume for the 6th option in any offense, and that's not going to be different for the Bills. As for having a non-quarterback do the quarterback sneak, I don't like that at all. I think that's asking a player to do something that they're not comfortable doing to do that, and I think that leads to errors. You're talking about a non-traditional player taking a snap. I mean, you see backup quarterbacks come in and don't take snaps effectively. So I'm not really interested in putting a running back or a tight end or a wide receiver under center taking a snap when that's not something that they ever do. There's a lot of muscle memory and mechanics and technique required to take a snap and then be able to drive forward and kind of feel where that spot is that's going to be soft, that you can get the quarterback sneak. There's more nuance to it than I think a lot of people want to admit. I mean, we lived through the Tyrod Taylor era. Guy couldn't do quarterback sneaks. And so it's not something for everybody. And I think when you start to ask non-traditional players to do things that they don't typically do, that's where mistakes happen. So I'm not interested in having fumbled snaps and all that type of stuff. Just Josh Allen or whatever team that quarterback is used to doing that, allow them to do it. Next one here comes from Chris, and this is another question that I've gotten from a number of people. Chris says, I'm listening to the All-22 review, and you mentioned the Bills are running more gap-schemed runs rather than zone-schemed runs. Can you explain to us fans what the differences are between these two types of run schemes? In addition, can you tell us what types of offensive linemen who excel in these two schemes are and what they do? It's a good question, and folks, I've said this before. If I get into scheme stuff that doesn't make sense, please, please, please ask, because I don't want there to be confusion. I want everyone to know what I'm talking about, and I think some of our best conversations have come through questions like this, so I appreciate Chris asking this, and a few other people asked this. So the difference between zone and gap blocking is this. For zone blocking, the offensive linemen, they block an area. They block a zone. And so it could be inside zone, it could be outside zone, but generally speaking, you're running zone left, zone right. And so the offensive linemen work together to create this horizontal movement to widen lanes. And in the back, the running back is supposed to read this, make one cut, and get downhill. It's the Kyle Shanahan offense, right? That's what they do. And a lot of the modern offenses, they lean more into these zone concepts, and there's a lot that you can build off of it. But it does require a bit more skill. You have a timing dynamic here. You have a need for offensive linemen that can move laterally, that can play together, right? There's a communication component within them that makes this, there's just a little bit more nuance to it. There's a simplicity to it. Zone left, zone right, inside zone, outside zone. There's a simplicity, but a complexity at the same time. But you need offensive linemen that can move laterally and have that athleticism to do that. And for your running back, you need a guy with great vision. You need somebody that can anticipate creases, make that one cut, and get downhill. And so that's what's required there. For gap runs, it's more predetermined tracks for the running backs. So the play is designed to go through a certain gap. So the tracks are predetermined for the running back, so they should be. And then the offensive linemen, they don't block an area, they block a man to create a hole. And so the difference there is you need more powerful run blockers, guys that can move bodies and create displacement and get players out of their gaps to create holes for the running backs to go through. And so the running back there, they still need to have good vision. They have to make those blocks right. But sometimes it's a little bit more necessary for them to have that second level vision, right? To be able to see through the first level and know how to make the right move in the hole to kind of spring the run. So just very different conceptually. And that's why I think it's hard to be a blended run scheme, right? And I think the Bills have often tried that as well, where they want to do both. And it's hard because the different skill sets required to run each scheme, the different timing and communication. And so it's a great idea to be good at both, but you have to be good at something before you can be great at everything, right? And I think the Bills kind of fell into that trap a little bit in the past. I like that they're sticking with what seems to be their most effective style of running the football, which is gap runs. And so hopefully that little explanation there was helpful to everybody in knowing what I mean by the differences between zone and gap runs. All right, we got some more to get to here, but first need to tell you about PrizePicks, which is the easiest, the funnest, the quickest way to play daily fantasy sports. The format is awesome. It's just you versus the numbers. It's not you against thousands of other players, including pros, including sharks. It's just you versus the numbers. All you do is you select two or more players, you pick more or less than their projected stats, and you place your entry. Doesn't take long. Picks can be made in under a minute. And when you win, the withdrawals are super quick and super easy. I love watching football. Love it even more when I have a PrizePicks entry going into the game. It just makes it that much more exciting. So go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, that's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks, daily fantasy sports made easy. All right, welcome back. Got a couple more to get to here today, but first would like to remind you and invite you to join the Locked On Bills subtext community. Check it out. There's a link in the show notes for today. So whether you're on YouTube or wherever you listen to the podcast, click on the show notes. You'll see a link to join. and it's super cool. Here's what you get with the Locked On Bills subtext community. You get one-on-one text messages with me. So if you have questions, comments about the team, we can text back and forth. I'm just a text message away, a direct line right to me. Love that. Have really enjoyed those conversations. You get my first reaction to all major Bills news. You get my live in-game texts. So as the game goes on, I send out like a lot of text messages that kind of just share what I'm thinking, things that I'm observing. So check it out. The Locked On Bills subtext community, a link in today's show notes to join. All right, the next one today comes from Bills WZA, which Bills WZA says, of course we are all ecstatic about the Bills win, including myself. However, how much should we be tempering our excitement based on how bad the Raiders are? May end up being one of the worst teams in the league. Looking back at last season, we were pumped about big early wins versus the Rams and Titans, who both ended up being pretty bad teams. I'll tell you what, I can understand this question, but the way I see it is this. The Bills were 9-point favorites against the Raiders. They beat them by 28. They dominated the football game. It wasn't close. And so that means a lot to me. And plus, I studied that Jets tape, and one of the biggest things I wanted to communicate was everything about the operation looked really good except for Josh Allen. And if Josh Allen's the biggest problem you have, you're probably going to be okay. And I thought that manifested itself against the Raiders. And so studying the tape gives me a lot of confidence that, hey, this is a good football team. This is a football team that can achieve a lot this season. And you mentioned last year beating the Rams and the Titans. Why are we poo-pooing over that? The Bills were 13-3 last year. They lost those 3 games by a combined 8 points. So are we trying to point to last year and having a couple of good early season performances and acting like the season didn't go well? They were 13-3. If the Bills played a close game against the Raiders, I could totally understand pushing back and saying, well, they beat the Raiders, but it was tight, lost to the Jets. I'm not sure this team's very good. It's not the case. Next one here comes from Nigel. Nigel says, year 2 in McDaniel's scheme, referring to Mike McDaniels, the head coach of the Dolphins, is clearly working well for Tua, as this Miami passing offense has looked borderline unstoppable up through week 2. Pass rush seems to be just about useless as Tua seems to get the ball out in what feels like 1 second. And in that 1 second, Hill and Waddle are getting separation because they are insanely fast. So 2-parter here. If you're the defensive coordinator of the Bills during week 4, when we play Miami, what's your plan of attack to limit Waddle and Hill? Alternatively, predictively, what do you think Sean will do as the DC? All right, so we're going to talk a lot about Miami next week. The Bills got to play the Commanders first. I have a lot of thoughts on Miami. They're a good football team. They're a good football team. They were a good football team last year. I said all offseason long, the biggest threat to the Bills in the AFC East, it's the Dolphins. Tua did this stuff last year too, folks. This isn't like new. If you paid attention to the Dolphins last year, he had huge passing statistics to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. This is the type of offense that they're capable of putting out on the field. They showed it to us last year. The key for Miami is sustainability, where whether it was injuries or just some different game plans that popped up along the way that limited that offense. So we'll see, right? I'm not ready to crown the Dolphins quite yet. I think they're a good football team. I think they're going to win a lot of games. I think they're going to be in the playoffs. I'm not diminishing them at all. But there's this huge uproar right now that I'm seeing that's this panic about the Dolphins. They did this last year. They just couldn't stay healthy, and there were some times where they couldn't sustain it. So let's let it play out. Let's play all 17 games and see what happens. As far as what I would do against Miami, I'll be a lot better suited to answer that question next week. But I'm guessing you're going to want to drop 8 and play a lot of coverage because you make a good point. Tua gets the ball out crazy fast. And you probably want as many people in coverage as possible. And committing a whole lot of pass rush against them is kind of useless. So I'm probably going to talk a lot about drop 8 coverage. I'm going to talk about some zone blitzing. But let's let this season play out before the whole world crowns the Miami Dolphins. They did this last year. Let's let it play out. Next one here comes from Craig. Craig says, the last few years, Josh has had a lot of influence on hiring. Dorsey, Allen, Barkley, probably others. I love Bean, met him. He was awesome to my dad, and I know he's a good to great GM. But perhaps Bean should be more focused on getting Allen some more experienced teammates in the quarterback room who may provide stability. This may also help him be more emotionally stable. It maybe help with his pocket issues. I guess just not sure his friends are what is important. I don't know about this question. I can understand why it was asked, but I don't find a lot of stuff that I agree with that you're kind of getting at with the way you asked the question. To me, it's all about making sure Josh Allen's comfortable. And surrounding him with people that he's comfortable with is going to make him comfortable with. Let's not act like Kyle Allen is some non-rosterable NFL player that they brought in because he's Josh Allen's buddy. Kyle Allen has been an NFL quarterback for 5 seasons prior to becoming a Buffalo Bill for 3 different teams. He's had experience. He's been a backup. He knows the role. It's not like he's only Josh Allen's friend. And I'll tell you what, I work with my best friend every single day, Kyle Krabs. We do Lockdown NFL scouting together. And obviously we work for the Lockdown Podcast Network. We push each other every single day. I can be honest and with him, I can challenge him in ways that I probably wouldn't want to challenge somebody that I didn't know that well. And I know everybody's different and everybody operates differently, but I don't really see this as an issue. I work with my best friend every day and we push each other and he motivates me to be my best. I motivate him to be my best, to be his best. We're better together. But ultimately, it's down to Josh Allen. Josh Allen's not a 21-year-old rookie. He's in year 6. He has to set the temperature of what's going on in that quarterback room. It's him. And so I think we always have these tendencies to point fingers and be concerned about everything about Josh Allen that isn't Josh Allen. He's the dude. He's the elite quarterback. You think we're talking about Peyton Manning and Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes and who the heck their backup quarterback is? And if they're friends or not? He's the dude. He's the alpha in the room. So I kind of get where you're bringing this up, but I just don't think this is a concern. Josh Allen is an elite NFL quarterback. He doesn't need his hand held. Make sure he's comfortable. Put people around him that make him comfortable. And as somebody who works with their best friend every day, we push each other really hard. Harder than if it was somebody I really didn't know. So that's my thoughts on that. All right, folks. That's going to do it for us here today on the podcast. Tomorrow, we turn our attention to the Washington Commanders. We have our crossover Thursday discussion with David Harrison, Locked On Commanders host, and then our primer on Friday before our last conversation on Saturday. So plenty of discussion coming your way. Don't miss anything. Make sure you're subscribed. Would love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day. Go Bills, and I look forward to catching up with you again tomorrow.